Okay, I think we're about ready to go. Welcome to today's webinar. As you'll notice, this is an audio-visual webinar as opposed to the ones we usually run, which are just text. So we're hoping you appreciate having a little bit more interactivity with us as we go. My name is Matthew Monagle. I am the web manager here at Columbia Business School of Executive Education, and we're joined today by Frank Rhodes. Frank is going to be talking to us about his upcoming strategic storytelling course and some of his research and case studies that he's found talking about how digital cultures and how Hollywood in particular markets in really interesting ways and sometimes not so successful ways. But before we get started, I want to run through just a few housekeeping tips. First of all, we will have a full recording of this webinar available, usually within 2 to 3 business days at the conclusion of it. So keep an eye out for that. If you're in the room, that means you're on our mailing list, and we'll send you a link directly to the video when it's completed. Also, we will be taking Q&A at the end. We have about 5 minutes for questions and answers. So you'll see on your screen there should be a little Q&A box. We'd encourage you throughout the presentation, as questions come to mind, please feel free to submit them, and we'll circle around back to them at the very end. So it is my great pleasure today to introduce Frank Rhodes. Frank is a leading writer. He's written for publications such as the New York Times and Strategy and Business. He's the author of, and I'm going to read this so I get the full title correct, The Art of Immersion, How the Digital Generation is Remaking Hollywood, Madison Avenue, and the Way We Tell Stories. And with Columbia, he is a senior fellow at the School of the Arts. He's a member of the Columbia Digital Storytelling Lab, and he's the faculty director for strategic storytelling. So Frank, welcome.
Hey, Matt. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm very excited to be doing this. Now, the title of today's webinar, of course, is Learning from Hollywood. And so the question is, what can we learn from Hollywood? It is probably, definitely the most successful movie industry in the world. So presumably they know something about storytelling, although admittedly you wouldn't always know it. I'm not going to look at how they tell stories in their movies today. I want to look at something a little bit different, which is how they tell stories to sell their movies, to sell their stories. And that really is sort of a different thing altogether. Now, let's start with these guys. They are, let's start with these guys. Steven Spielberg, of course, and George Lucas, they know a couple of things about selling movies. In fact, between them, they invented the blockbuster in the 70s with Jaws and Star Wars. Now, a couple of years ago, they were at a symposium at the University of Southern California, and they said there was a very interesting conversation that they had. And part of it was this exchange, where Spielberg said, the experience is never going to be totally immersive as long as we're looking at a screen. It doesn't matter if it's a movie screen, it's a computer screen, we've got to put the player inside the experience. So you're surrounded by a 3D experience. That's the feature, he said. Now, there are a couple of things that I think are kind of extraordinary here in terms of what he said. First off, most people think of screens as a window, not as a barrier. But to Spielberg, they're a barrier. They prevent the viewers or the players from participating directly. And that leads to the question of how do we get inside the experience? What can we do there? And why do we even want to go there in the first place? So there have been a lot of studies that show that people want to immerse themselves in fictional worlds, and especially millennials. It's not entirely hard to figure out why. The rise of video games, the rise of the internet, it's become a very participatory culture, which is completely different from the sort of sit-back TV culture of the past. But in fact, the desire for immersion is nothing new. It's kind of just a general human response to fiction, to stories of any type. In 16th and 17th century Europe, books were the latest technology, and they were considered sometimes dangerously immersive, the same way video games are now, because they yielded a sense of immersion that was never before possible. in Cervantes' satire, Don Quixote was a man who so immersed himself in books that he dried out his brain. And that's why he went tilting at windmills, because he had lost his mind from immersing himself in tales of chivalry. Now, there have been a lot of milestones since, obviously, but one of the biggest involved this guy, and not necessarily in a good way. When Harry Potter was written, expectations were low. They were very low. A dozen publishers turned it down. Bloomsbury, the original British publisher, only picked it up because the chairman's 8-year-old daughter read it and thought it was terrific. The first print run was under 1,000 copies, and most of those were given away to libraries. But obviously, it took off, and it took off really fast. Within a couple of years, kids were lining up around the block outside bookstores to get it as soon as the store opened. And what that meant, ultimately, was that there's a lot of money at stake. In fact, now, 15 years later, Harry Potter is one of the biggest franchises in the movie business. It's topped only by the Marvel Cinematic Universe, based, of course, on North American box office, but that's pretty illustrative of across the board. It's bigger than Star Wars, it's bigger than Batman, it's bigger than James Bond. And with that kind of potential, Warner Brothers, which had bought the film rights to the stories, wasn't going to take any chances. It had paid a lot for those rights, and it was about to spend even more making the movies and marketing the movies. So that meant it had to protect its property. So you might wonder, protect it from whom? Well, obviously counterfeiters to start with, but anybody who tried to use the name or the likeness of Harry Potter, and that included fans. So because the studio had a very old school view of fans and what their role was. To them, movie audiences were consumers, and that's what they were supposed to do. They were supposed to sit back and consume. So when Warner Brothers saw people making unauthorized use of their trademark, Harry Potter, this trademark that they'd invested so much in, they did what comes naturally. They threatened to sue. But because the Harry Potter books and stories sold mainly to kids, that's who they were threatening to sue. Little kids, 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds around the world. That didn't go so well with this particular person. Heather Lawver was a 16-year-old girl who lived in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. She had started an online newspaper named the Daily Prophet, which was, of course, a paper that was read by wizards in the Potter stories. She herself was not actually threatened by Warner, but many other fans who had started Harry Potter websites were, and she took offense. So she started an organization called Defense Against the Dark Arts, and she launched a boycott against Harry Potter merchandise. Then in December 2000, a 15-year-old girl named Claire Field in West Yorkshire in England received a threatening letter demanding that she close her fan site, harrypotterguide.co.uk, and surrender the web address to Warner. And unlike most of the kids who received letters like this, she decided to fight back. So she and her father, excuse me, engaged a solicitor, and they launched a public campaign against the studio, beginning with an interview in the Daily Mirror. There was a London city councilman named Alistair Alexander who jumped in. He started a fan empowerment site. And before long, Warner Brothers was being excoriated from pulpits all across Britain for threatening to sue little kids. This was obviously a public relations disaster, and before long, Warner's backed down. But so with that, the Potter War, as it was called, was over. Today, it's a landmark case, but it's taken a lot of entertainment companies years to catch on, years to get the message, and some of them still have it. But gradually, Gradually, they're coming to realize that although they might own the copyright, it's the fans who own the magic. So let's fast forward a couple of years. Avatar, James Cameron. I interviewed James Cameron for Wired and then later for my book, The Art of Immersion. And he talked about, at that point, this was before he had actually started making Avatar, he described it as a kind of action-adventure film, that an Edgar Rice Burroughs style action-adventure film that happens to take place on another planet. And he said that for him, the point of a story like this, the best way to tell a story like this was to create a kind of fractal-like complexity. Now, we're familiar with fractals. They're patterns that repeat themselves as you get in closer and closer. So like coastlines or snowflakes are a classic example. So Cameron said, what the casual viewer can enjoy the story, can just watch the movie without having to drill down to the secondary and tertiary levels of detail. They can just watch the movie. But for the real fan, you want to be able to pull in powers of 10 and as many times as you want, and the pattern still holds. To me, he said, that's the best science fiction. Now, Cameron also, of course, invented a camera system that enabled him to shoot in 3D. Why did he do that? To eliminate the perception that you were looking at a screen. Because we're used to seeing the screen as a window, but as Spielberg said, now we're starting to see it as a barrier. It's not just the screen that we want to get rid of. It's anything that comes between us and the experience, anything that makes it less immediate. So Cameron set out to build the world of Pandora and make it accessible to people. He created something called the Pandorapedia, which was an online encyclopedia that provided detailed information on every aspect of life on Pandora. And, you know, I sort of got a personal sense of what this kind of fame meant when I was talking to a friend who lives in Brussels, and he told me that his 9-year-old son wanted to know where he could learn Navi. And my friend was like desperate to find a Navi school. But ultimately, Cameron was frustrated in his ambitions. He devoted an enormous amount of resources to creating a video game that unfortunately turned out to be a bit of a dud. Meanwhile, Fox, the movie studio, did what movie studios are used to doing. They focused on McDonald's and Coca-Cola, their promo tie-ins. These were tie-ins that were designed to provide quote-unquote authentic journalism from quote-unquote online journalists on Pandora. So authentic fake journalism, if you will. But so what happened really here was, in the case of Avatar, they tried to go in an order of magnitude, but ultimately the pattern did not hold. Still, of course, Avatar didn't do all that badly, even if it didn't quite live up to Cameron's hopes. But what could it have been? I think that's what we'll find out when the sequels are released. Now, there's one more story I want to take a look at. That's The Walking Dead. It premiered shortly after Avatar, in fact, in 2010, and it quickly became the most watched series on US cable TV. And of course, I think we're all familiar with the story. It's about what happens in Atlanta after an outbreak of zombification. And in this poster, you can glean some important tips, I think. First off, don't take the train. Don't take the freeway. And whatever you do, don't stay in your condo. But The Walking Dead is not just a show. There's a comic that it's based on. And there's a show about the show, Talking Dead, which runs immediately afterwards. And then there's all kinds of other stuff. There's a TV miniseries. There are video games. There's a novelization. There's an online quiz. There's a Tumblr fan for, a Tumblr site for fan art. There's a mobile app. And there's even a zombie school, a live zombie school in Atlanta, where if you want to be an extra on the show, you can go there and they'll teach you how to be a zombie. So basically what you have is this huge family of properties that are all engaged in telling the Walking Dead story. I've color-coded them here according to their function, whether they're the primary source material, whether they're fan-powered, like the wiki, of course, whether their primary purpose is to bring in new fans or keep old fans tied to the show. But basically what you have is the TV show at the top and then all of this other stuff that's trailing it. So what you have here is, it's not just a story. You're creating a world for people to inhabit. Now, research shows that when people read a story or watch a movie or watch a TV show, they project themselves into the story. They project themselves imaginatively. And once inside, they look around and they kind of set up shop. And that's what's happening here, really. And it's been crucial to building the Walking Dead franchise. As this quote from Charlie Collier, the president of AMC, shows, TV shows come and go. They're on for a few hours, for a few weeks, and then they go away. But that's not the way things work anymore. Today, the TV show is really just the beginning. So I wanted to kind of tie this to other situations as well, because it's not just for Hollywood. These are techniques and strategies that can be used anywhere. You need to tell a story. You need to build a world. And if people want to inhabit your world, you need to make room for them to do so. It's all about what's called co-creation. You're not delivering something to be consumed anymore. You're co-creating a story with your audience. And it's important to remember, they're your partners, they're not your target. Second, this means it's not enough just to tell the story. You need to build the world that people can move into imaginatively. For example, Burberry, the clothing company, the luxury clothing company, has created a very fully realized, fully built out website that's far more than just an e-commerce site. And they call it Burberry World, which I think is really indicative. It's a place where people who, like Burberry, can go and learn all kinds of stuff beyond ordering their, ordering a coat. They can do just about anything, including, post photos on a Tumblr. There's a music page on the site where Burberry posts web videos that they've made of young English bands, most of them pretty unknown. What companies like Burberry and certainly AMC have come to realize is that the story is no good if you try to own it. It's, as Harry Potter showed, it's the fans who own the magic. And finally, you want to make your contact with people as directly as possible. You certainly want to have a service account on Twitter. You can have a Tumblr that people can post to, a Snapchat that speaks to them directly. Burberry World has actually set the pattern for Burberry's real-life stores, for their flagship stores in London and Hong Kong and Shanghai, so that the stores are literally patterned after the website, so that when you go into the store, it's a complete environment, and you are, very consciously surrounded by all things Burberry. And then there's something like the AMC Zombie School, a real-life experience that ties into the fictional universe. So that's kind of what I want to say. Thank you so much for joining us. And Matt, do you have any questions?
I have a few questions that I want to ask. I would encourage the rest of you to use the Q&A box to ask some questions as well. We've got about, I think, 10 minutes today for questions, so we've got plenty of time for them. But as you were talking and as I was listening, a few came to mind. I'll start with one of mine that I think will be relevant to a lot of people back home, and that is, how well do you have to know your customers in order to start thinking of these immersive techniques? Is it enough to know some basic information about them? Is it enough to know that they're interested in you? Or you really have to know what their habits are, what they're doing with their day-to-day in order to start developing these things?
Well, I think you can start without knowing all of that, but obviously the more you know about your customers, the better. And there's a tremendous amount of data that's available now. And if you have access to that, you're in a very good position. Netflix obviously has used that to very good purpose. And to the extent that they're able to tailor their shows directly to a certain kind of customer. And I don't mean that they, micromanage the production of the show. I mean that they choose shows that are going to appeal to certain types of people and certain groups of their customers. So the more you know, the better. And that's
good.
Yeah.
Another question, we've actually gotten some questions, so thanks to everyone who's participating. We love to see these coming in. One thing that we always get when we talk to our faculty and the experts about business patterns, business techniques, is the B2B application. Is there any way that some of these things can be used in the B2B world so that businesses that are talking to other businesses can start using these to think about, I'm not targeting an individual, I'm targeting companies, but I might use these same kind of immersive techniques to get the company part of involved in my world as well?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I think B2B is an excellent example of something like this. GE has used immersive storytelling techniques extremely effectively. Beth Comstock, who was the chief marketing officer and is now the vice chairman, has really championed this. And it serves a couple of different purposes. One is for the morale of the employees. It's really, a morale booster to see videos that get posted online that show what they're doing and that celebrate their work. Building jet engines, for example, which is something, of course, GE is very big on. But the other thing, the other kind of audience that you want to reach is, of course, your customers. And there, I think, the customers are, very self-defined. And it's not like you have to launch a huge, sort of awareness campaign, a brand awareness campaign. You need to be able to speak to them directly. And I think these techniques are very effective at doing that.
Right. Now, we've had a few questions people always want to know, too, when we talk about technology, about emerging technologies. People have asked about things like VR. Mm-hmm. How much time and energy should people put into these technologies that are still kind of on the frontier, what we can do, and how much time should they spend consolidating what's there, what's established, and then moving forward with that? Yeah. Do you think they should be into VR? Do you think companies should be thinking about, maybe even mid to smaller businesses, or should they be thinking about these spaces?
Well, it's certainly fun to think about, and it's fun to experiment with. And I know a lot of brands and a lot of companies are doing that. So, but at this point, it's still pretty experimental. And there are also not a lot of, obviously not a lot of people who have the headsets that really enable you to take advantage of this. So, but from my point of view, I think where it really makes sense is for a company that is, that sort of touches the consumer directly and has kind of a real world location where you can go and try out something in VR. Like a company like Samsung, for example, or Sony. Of course, they're involved in VR to begin with, but where you have these kind of consumer experiences, it can be a very fun thing for people to do.
That's cool. We've had a few more questions. Somebody brought up, and thank you for this because I think it's a fascinating case study. I wanted to talk about Warner Brothers' recent slate of superhero films and sort of I want to say failure, but sort of the struggles they had in their connecting with their audience. And I think sort of the larger question that comes out of movies like Batman versus Superman is, when is the tail wagging the dog? When are you letting audiences dictate the kind of movies you're making, when maybe you should be focusing on storytelling or focusing on creating a unique experience? Should people be cautious about creating products just because their customers say this is what we want, this is what we need? Should they have a little bit of safety net in there for them to kind of make those decisions as well?
Right. Well, Steve Jobs famously said, the customer doesn't know what they want until they see it. And there's certainly an element to that. And I think a big problem that Hollywood has had lately with its focus on, blockbuster action films is there's just kind of a fatigue that's set in. These films are just too much like each other. And so it's difficult to sort of break out. Now, at the same time, though, that Batman versus Superman was, had very disappointing results, Disney had a tremendous success. And I think that had a lot to do with the fact of who was running things. It did not appear that the people who were making Batman versus Superman were really all that committed to it. Whereas the people who run Marvel at Disney are very committed to it. They're real fans themselves. And that creates a kind of authenticity that really can't be faked.
Now, I think we have time for about one more question. So I wanted to ask one that kind of takes a step back and I think focuses on something that's interesting, just the idea of storytelling. Where should businesses be thinking about bringing themselves into narratives? How can they think about constructing narratives? Is it worth it for people to go out and read, The Power of One, or these kind of like epic stories and heroic archetypes, and think about how they can apply those to their companies? Are there universal things that should be implemented?
Well, that's certainly a good question. I think that, basically every person has a story, every brand has a story, every company has a story. And so the point, what you need to do is to, first off, unearth those stories and then figure out which ones are, going to be worth telling, frankly. When Angela Ahrendts took over as CEO of Burberry in, I think it was about 2005 or so. She's now, by the way, the head of retail at Apple. But when she took over as CEO, the company was in really bad shape. And one of the first things that she did was she hired an anthropologist. This is a company that was founded in 1857 by a 23-year-old, clothier named Thomas Burberry. It has lots of stories. So the question is really, which of those stories are people likely to connect to? And I think that's really the question.
Great. Well, I want to say thank you so much for your time today. We've gotten a lot of really great information here. The next course that you're going to be teaching, Strategic Storytelling, the next iteration of that is October 20th to 21st. Yes. Could you speak just a little bit for the people that are watching about what they can expect in that course? It's a 2-day course, correct?
Yes, it's a 2-day course. We're doing it at the Norwood Club, actually, which is downtown in Lower Manhattan. And it really is a seminar, very in-depth, 9 to 5 or 5:30 p.m. both days. And it gives you a very in-depth look at the kinds of things that I was talking about here. One of the first things I do is look at why stories are so important. What is it about stories that has an effect on us, and what kind of effect does it have, and why do they have those effects? There's been a great deal of neuroscience and cognitive psychology research over the past 15 years or so that has revealed some very, very interesting points about this. That stories, for example, are really the most powerful persuaders we have. They're much more powerful at changing people's opinions than are arguments, logical arguments. It's what we're used to making. So the uses of storytelling, The ways that both entertainment companies and other brands have used immersive storytelling to, to bring people in, to, sort of convert consumers into fans, and to build a sense of identity that goes far beyond just, there's a logo, I like that brand. People can really be involved now where they couldn't before. And if you can bring them in that way, it's possible to be successful in a whole different way.
That's very interesting. So I know I follow you on social media, so I know that you're always posting not only your own articles that you're writing for publications like the New York Times, you're also posting really interesting content by other leading thinkers and other authors who are writing in the digital space. If people wanted to follow you, what's the preferred channel? Are you on Twitter? Are you on LinkedIn?
Sure. So it's at Frank Rose on Twitter. LinkedIn is, I think it's LinkedIn/Frank Rose, and I have a Facebook page that's facebook.com/Frank Rose.
That's great. Well, Frank, thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks to everyone else who attended. We hope you found some information in here useful, and we'll be sure to see you next time.
Thank you.